Hey guys, I hope you're all hanging in there. I know we haven't done any online lectures this semester, so this might feel a little strange at first, but I've set it up so it's as similar to class as possible and as easy to jump into as possible. So after this little introduction, I'm just going to do a voiceover PowerPoint slides for the remainder. And I've broken the lecture up into 2 chunks so they're more manageable. And one of the great repercussions of this is that you can pause, rewind, and re-listen as many times as you'd like. I've also set up a discussion thread on Canvas so that if you have any questions that pop up when you're watching the videos, you can post them there and I'll either answer them online or we'll talk about them in class when we get back. So let's go ahead and launch in. In the next 2 lectures, we're going to be talking about personality processes. And so in this first lecture, we'll do a very brief overview and then talk about perception and thought. In part 2 of the lecture, we'll cover motivation and emotion. So to begin, personality processes are defined as mechanisms that unfold over time to produce the effects of personality traits. In other words, personality processes can be thought of as the ways that personality traits end up producing an outcome. And in the field of psychology, there's a long history of trying to understand personality processes, which has resulted in a number of different theories, which we've touched on throughout the semester. These theories range from learning theories, or what we might call behavioral theories, that focus on observable manifestations of personality, to social learning theories, which are more focused on the role of interpretation, evaluation, and decision-making on behavioral manifestations of personality. Phenomenological theories are focused on how people think about their experiences, with the idea that these subjective interpretations shape personality and behavior. We've talked about how psychoanalysis purports that personality is determined by compromises between the conscious and the unconscious. Biological approaches consider how personality is shaped by genetics, brain structure, and other biological factors. And we've also talked about trait approaches, the proponents of which believe that people have inherently different and relatively stable personalities. And all of these different theories have given us information about how to make sense of various manifestations of personality. So, how do we make sense of why people do what they do in the way that they do it? In particular, and as your book outlines, these various theories have been specifically applied to understanding 4 main processes: perception, thought, motivation, and emotion. With the notion that by understanding these 4 processes, we can also gain information about a person's personality because all 4 of these processes are thought to be reflective of personality traits. So let's start with perception. The overall premise is that a person's personality predisposes him or her to perceive the world in a certain way. So, for example, from this perspective, it would be argued that whether you saw this picture as 2 people talking or 3 vases is a reflection of your personality. And there are a few key ideas that arise in the field of personality psychology as it relates to perception. The first of these ideas is that of priming, which is the notion that if we repeatedly perceive or think about a certain concept or idea, then that concept or idea is, over time, going to come quickly and easily to mind. And when that happens, when certain ideas or concepts come easily to mind, we say they are chronically accessible. And personality theorists would say that how easily ideas become primed and therefore chronically accessible, and also the types of ideas that are easily primed and accessible, is a reflection of our personalities. That our personalities end up making us more likely to readily access certain types of ideas or concepts. So we can sort of think of priming as our stuff. Now, stuff is a technical term in the field of counseling psychology, and it encapsulates your vulnerabilities, your buttons that are easily pressed, those things that end up making it more likely for you to ping off of certain emotions or thoughts or situations. So, for example, if I was someone who was consistently worried about fitting in and being perceived positively by my peers, I would be more likely to prime behaviors, situations, or circumstances that supported the idea that I'm not welcomed or liked. And because that thought of not being liked is chronically accessible to me, I see it in everything around me. So my stuff ends up making it more likely for certain ideas to be primed in my mind. Now, according to researchers, there are a number of things that can affect priming, but probably the most common are evolution, temperament, experience, and values. Evolutionarily, we know that we're more likely to pay attention to things that are beneficial to our survival and reproduction. Our temperament also likely plays a role in the type of things we prime. Our experience as well ends up making us more likely to prime certain types of information than others, as well as our values. So, as Funder mentions in your book, if you're raised with certain values, then you're more likely to pay attention to manifestations of those values in others. So, for example, if you are raised in a family that prioritized morality, so what is right versus what is wrong, then you're primed to pay attention to moral or immoral behavior in others. And this leads to a really interesting thought experiment, which is to try and think of what values you were primed with. So when you think about your background and what was prioritized when you were growing up, it could be anything: competition, benevolence, success, but what do you find yourself primed to notice in others? Funder also notes that perception researchers have also claimed that chronic accessibility has been found especially powerful in the development of two key things: rejection sensitivity, which is when people are primed for any indication that they're going to be rejected by others. And researchers have found that this can create a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you're expecting to be rejected, you're also less likely to be warm or friendly to others, which will likely lead to rejection that you most fear. So there's this cycle that can get created. Similarly, researchers have also found that people can become more aggressive because they're primed for hostility from others. So if you grow up in an environment that's relatively unsafe and where people are more likely to be hostile to you, then you're more likely to look for hostility, and in order to protect yourself, you're also more likely to act more aggressive as well. But one of the very cool things that researchers have also found is that we can guard ourselves from certain types of priming. And we talked about this before when we were talking about psychoanalysis, and it got many of your hackles up when we talked about the study in which researchers had flashed dirty and not dirty words on a screen for a split second and found that people couldn't perceive the dirty words while they could perceive the not dirty words. Now, we talked about some of the possible pitfalls of that research already. However, the conclusion that's been drawn from the scholarship is that we all have what are called perceptual defenses, essentially some type of mechanism for screening out information that makes us uncomfortable or anxious, which Freud would call the ego. Unfortunately, these perceptual defenses aren't always so effective, so at times we end up perceiving and even over-perceiving that which we fear the most. So that's the bit on perceptions. Let's move on to talking about thought. So what personality theorists would say is that in addition to affecting our perceptions, personalities may also predispose people to think in certain ways, which can ultimately determine many, but not all of our actions. And this is where a lot of Freud's work has been extremely influential, because if you remember, it was Freud who first proposed the existence of the unconscious, this huge swath of our minds that are generally inaccessible to us. And what sits on top of the unconscious, the proverbial tip of the iceberg, is the conscious mind, which can be thought of as whatever an individual has in mind at the moment, based on the person's ongoing control of reality. So how they perceive reality in the moment based on previous experience. And what cognitive psychologists, and those are the folks that spend their time thinking about how thoughts work, what they've said is that consciousness, which is thought to be seated in the short-term memory, has an extremely limited capacity. So it can only hold on to 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information at any given time. And when you think about it, that's really not that much information. But let's give it a try. So here's the deal. I'm going to say a string of numbers, and when I'm finished, I just want you to repeat them back. So talk to your computer screen, and so you're just going to say what I say. Ready? 7, 3, 2, 6, 3, 4. Go ahead, repeat it back. Did you get it right? What about this one? 8, 5, 7, 9, 2, 3, 4, 6. Now that was 8 digits, so for many of us, that's pushing our capacity. But let's try one more. So again, you're just going to repeat back to your computer, same thing that I say. Here it goes. 2, 1, 4, 6, 8, 4, 7, 6, 5, 9. Go ahead, repeat it back. Now that was 10 digits, and frankly, I would be really surprised if most of you got that one, because that's well beyond what is typical capacity for our working memory. And as you can imagine, having that limited capacity can create a lot of barriers in terms of growth and development, because 7 bits of information simply isn't that much. And that's why we all learn to chunk information. So we learn that instead of remembering 2, 1, 4, 6, and 8 as separate pieces of information, we can group them together as 21,468, and then we've only used one slot of information. And in many ways, and as Funder notes, this is what education is all about. Helping us learn how to chunk information in more effective ways so that it doesn't take up the limited space in our conscious minds, so we can use that space for other higher order processes. In addition to the perceptual defense research that I mentioned before, support for the existence of the unconscious has also come from the fact that we can do things without knowing why, we can know things without knowing that we know them, and we can have thoughts and feelings that we don't understand. But despite this evidence, there's still a lot that is unknown about how the conscious and unconscious minds work. And so, in an effort to better understand those thought processes, a number of scholars have proposed what are called dual process theories, which essentially attempt to explain how conscious and unconscious mental processes can simultaneously exist. One example of the dual process theory is Epstein's cognitive experiential self theory, or CEST. And what Epstein suggested is that the mind is made up of 2 separate systems: a rational system that is analytical, slow, deliberate, effortful, and logical, kind of like the conscious mind, and also an experiential system, which is holistic in the sense that it examines the full gestalt of an experience rather than breaking it down into its component parts. It's quick, intuitive, automatic, and emotional, so more like the unconscious. And these 2 systems are interactive, and both are essential because without either of these pieces, we wouldn't be able to take in information and then adapt to specific situations. So we'll stop there for this online lecture. In part 2, we'll move on to talking about motivation and emotion.